The galaxy was a vast and quiet place, but lately it had been anything but peaceful. For months, tensions had been rising between the Terran Empire and the Zetherian coalition. The two sides had been locked in talks that seemed to go nowhere. Every meeting ended with more arguments, more accusations, and less hope for a solution. Finally, the Terran Empire decided enough was enough. Chancellor William Hayes, the leader of Earth, gave the Zetherians an ultimatum. Stop expanding into neutral territories or face the consequences. The deadline came and went, and there was no response from the Zetherians. No apology, no promise to stop. Nothing. It was clear they weren't interested in peace. Now, the Terran Empire had no choice but to act. What had started as a diplomatic effort was about to become something far more dangerous, a war, Commander. Daniel Carter stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, the flagship of the Terran fleet. He stared at the holographic map floating in front of him. Tiny dots represented ships, planets, and outposts scattered across the contested sector of space. His mind raced as he thought about what was coming next. This wasn't just another mission. This was the beginning of something that could change everything. Beside him, Lieutenant Rachel Monroe reviewed reports from the fleet. She looked up and spoke quietly, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "We're as ready as we can be," she said, glancing at Daniel. Her eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of reassurance. Daniel nodded slowly, but inside he felt uneasy. He knew the stakes were high. If things went wrong, the cost would be unimaginable. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. His crew needed him to be strong, even if he didn't feel that way. On Earth, journalist Emily Dawson sat in her small office, typing furiously on her keyboard. She had spent the last few days interviewing people about the looming conflict. Some were angry and supported the Chancellor's decision to fight. Others were scared, worried about what a war would mean for their families and their future. Emily listened carefully to everyone she spoke to, trying to capture the mood of the planet. She knew this story was important not just because it was big news, but because it mattered. People needed to understand what was happening, even if they couldn't see it firsthand. Emily paused for a moment and looked out the window. Outside, life went on as usual. People walked down the streets, cars drove by, and children played in the park. It was strange to think that so far away, decisions were being made that could affect all of them. She shook her head and turned back to her computer. There was still work to do. Back on the Eclipse, Daniel moved through the ship, checking on his crew. Morale was mixed. Some soldiers were eager to prove themselves, while others were quiet, lost in thought. Daniel understood both reactions. He remembered his first battle, how nervous he had been. Over time he learned to push those feelings aside, but they never truly went away. War was never easy, no matter how many times you faced it. As the hours passed, the tension aboard the ship grew thicker. Everyone knew the order to attack could come at any moment. Finally it did. A message came through from Fleet Command. The operation was a go. The Terran fleet would strike at dawn, or rather, at the equivalent of dawn in space, where the sun never rose. Daniel gathered his team in the briefing room. He explained the plan one last time, making sure everyone understood their roles. The goal was simple: hit key Zetherian outposts along the border and weaken their defenses. It wouldn't end the war, but it would send a message. The Terran Empire wasn't backing down. When the meeting ended, Daniel returned to the bridge. He watched as the fleet moved into position, each ship glowing faintly against the blackness of space. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. Rachel joined him, holding a cup of coffee. She offered him some, but he shook his head. He didn't want anything to distract him now. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Rachel asked after a long silence. Her question caught Daniel off guard. He hadn't expected her to ask something like that, especially not now. But then again, maybe she was wondering the same things he was. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we don't have much of a choice. They didn't leave us one." Rachel nodded, though she didn't look convinced. She turned her attention back to the monitors, scanning for updates. Daniel did the same, focusing on the task ahead. There would be time to think about the bigger picture later if they survived. The attack began without warning. The Terran Fleet surged forward, weapons blazing. Zetherian ships responded quickly, firing back with equal force. Explosions lit up the darkness as ships on both sides took damage. Daniel led his squadron through the chaos, weaving between enemy fighters and dodging blasts. His hands gripped the controls tightly, every movement precise and deliberate. Years of training kicked in, guiding him through the madness. Rachel stayed glued to her station. Relaying information to the rest of the fleet, her voice remained steady, even as panic crackled over the coms. Ships called for backup, reported casualties, and requested repairs. Rachel listened to it all, filtering out the noise to focus on what mattered most. She knew her job was critical. Without her, the fleet would be blind dot as the battle raged on. Daniel spotted a group of Zetherian bombers heading toward one of the larger Terran cruisers. He radioed his team and ordered them to intercept. Together they swooped in, taking out the bombers before they could reach their target. The cruiser's captain sent a quick thank you over the coms, but there was no time to celebrate. More enemies were closing in. Back on Earth, Emily watched live footage of the battle on her screen. Cameras mounted on drones captured the action from every angle. Burning ships drifted silently through space, their crews either dead or scrambling to escape. Pods launched from damaged vessels, tiny dots against the endless void. Emily felt sick to her stomach. She had covered wars before, but seeing it happen in real time, knowing people were dying right now, was different. She took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was doing this. People needed to know the truth. They deserved to understand what was happening, even if it was hard to watch. With renewed determination, she began writing her article, describing the events as they unfolded. Her words painted a vivid picture, bringing the distant conflict closer to home. Meanwhile, aboard the Eclipse, the fight continued. Daniel and his team pushed deeper into enemy territory, targeting strategic locations marked on their maps. Each success brought them closer to achieving their objective, but it also drew more attention from the Zetherians. Reinforcements poured in, forcing the Terrans to adapt quickly. Daniel barked orders to his pilots, keeping them focused and organized. Despite the odds, they held their ground. Rachel worked tirelessly, coordinating attacks and tracking movements. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting commands and analyzing data. She barely noticed the fatigue creeping up on her. All that mattered was keeping the fleet informed and alive. Finally, after what felt like hours, the order came to retreat. The initial strike had done its job, dealing significant damage to the Zetherians' border defenses. Now it was time to regroup and plan the next move. Daniel led his squadron back to the Eclipse, his heart pounding with relief and exhaustion. As they docked, he allowed himself a brief moment to close his eyes and breathe. Rachel greeted him as he stepped onto the bridge. Her face was pale, but she managed a weak smile. "We did it," she said softly. Daniel nodded, though he didn't feel much like celebrating. The victory was small, and the cost had been high. Too many good people had been lost. Still, they had taken the first step. The war was far from over, but the Terran Empire had shown it wouldn't back down. Whatever happened next, Daniel knew they would face it together. And for now, that was enough. The first strike had been successful, but the cost was high. Ships were damaged, lives were lost, and the Terran fleet needed time to recover, yet there was no time to rest. The Zetherians were furious, and their retaliation came swiftly. Patrols along the border increased, and skirmishes erupted almost daily. The galaxy was on fire, and neither side showed any sign of backing down. Commander Daniel Carter stood in the briefing room aboard the Eclipse, staring at a new set of orders. From Fleet Command, this time the mission was different. It wasn't about hitting random outposts or testing the enemy's defenses. This was about gathering intelligence, finding a way to cripple the Zetherians before they could regroup and strike back harder. According to intercepted transmissions, the Zetherians were developing a superweapon. If completed, it could turn the tide of the war in their favor. The Terran Empire couldn't let that happen. Daniel turned to his team. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe sat at the table, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her. Sergeant Alex Rivera leaned against the wall. arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Two other crew members, Ensign Lavra Kim and Corporal Mark Taylor, listened intently as Daniel explained the plan. They were going behind enemy lines to a heavily guarded research facility hidden on a moon orbiting a distant gas giant. Their mission was simple: infiltrate the base, steal the blueprints for the Super Weapon, and get out alive. "This isn't going to be easy," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "We'll have to move fast and stay quiet. If we're caught, there won't be anyone coming to rescue us." No one spoke. The weight of the mission hung in the air like a storm cloud. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "What happens if we fail?" she asked, her tone calm but curious. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Then we'll lose the war," he said bluntly. "This is our best chance to stop them before it's too late." Rachel nodded, though her hands trembled slightly, as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't say anything else, but Daniel could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. Not when so much was at stake. The team spent the next few hours preparing for the mission. Equipment was checked and rechecked, weapons were loaded, and plans were reviewed until everyone knew them by heart. When the time came, they boarded a small stealth vessel designed to avoid detection. As the ship launched from the eclipse, Daniel glanced back at the flagship one last time. He hoped they would return to it, but he couldn't afford to think about failure now. The journey to the moon took several hours. The trip was tense but uneventful. When they arrived, the team suited up and prepared to disembark. The moon was barren and cold, its surface littered with jagged rocks and deep craters. The research facility loomed in the distance, a massive structure built into the side of a cliff. Lights glowed faintly from within, and patrols of Zetherian soldiers moved around the perimeter. "Stay close and keep your heads down," Daniel whispered as they approached. The team moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open areas. Every sound made them freeze, every movement in the distance made them hold their breath. It felt like walking through a minefield, where one wrong step could mean disaster. They reached the outer wall of the facility without incident. Using specialized tools, Rachel hacked into the security system, disabling cameras and alarms long enough for the team to slip inside. Once inside, they found themselves in a maze of corridors and rooms. The air smelled metallic, and the hum of machinery echoed through the halls. Soldiers patrolled regularly, forcing the team to duck into alcoves or hide behind crates whenever footsteps approached. Lavra and Mark stayed near the entrance, ready to provide cover if needed. Meanwhile, Daniel, Rachel, and Alex pressed deeper into the facility. Their goal was the central database where the blueprints for the Super Weapon were stored. Rachel led the way, using her tablet to track the layout of the building and locate the server room. Her hands moved quickly over the screen, her focus absolute. "This way," she whispered, pointing down a narrow hallway. The team followed her, their boots making barely a sound on the metal floor. Just as they rounded a corner, a group of Zetherian guards appeared ahead of them. There was no time to hide. Daniel signaled for Alex to take the lead. In one fluid motion, Alex raised his weapon and fired, taking out the guards before they could react. The shots were muffled by silencers, but the noise still sent a jolt of panic through the team. "Move!" Daniel hissed, pushing them forward. They sprinted past the fallen guards and into the next corridor. Alarms blared overhead, red lights flashing throughout the facility. They had been discovered. Rachel cursed under her breath, but kept moving. They were close now, so close. She spotted the door to the server room and rushed toward it, her fingers flying over the keypad. Sweat dripped down her face as she worked to bypass the lock. Behind them, shouts echoed through the halls as more guards closed in. "Hurry!" Alex barked, taking position near the door to cover them. Bullets ricocheted off the walls as the Zetherians opened fire. Daniel joined Alex, returning fire to keep the enemy at bay. His heart pounded in his chest, each shot feeling like it might be his last. Finally, the door clicked open. Rachel slipped inside, her hands shaking as she connected her tablet to the mainframe. Lines of code scrolled across the screen as she searched for the files they needed. Time seemed to slow down as she worked, every second stretching into eternity. Outside, the firefight grew more intense. Alex and Daniel exchanged worried glances but held their ground. "I've got it," Rachel exclaimed suddenly. She yanked the tablet free and shoved it into her pack. "Let's go." The team didn't waste a moment. They burst out of the server room and ran back the way they came, ducking and weaving to avoid enemy fire. Lavra and Mark met them halfway, covering fire as they retreated. Together, they fought their way to the exit, their movements fueled by desperation. By the time they reached the stealth vessel, they were battered and bruised, but alive. As the engines roared to life and the ship lifted off, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had done it. They had the intel. But the victory was bittersweet. One of their own, Corporal Mark Taylor, hadn't made it. He had stayed behind to hold off the enemy, giving the rest of the team a chance to escape. Back aboard the Eclipse, the mood was somber. The stolen data was handed over to Fleet Command, who immediately began analyzing it. Meanwhile, the crew mourned the loss of Mark. His sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten on Earth. Journalist Emily Dawson received word of the covert mission. Details were scarce, but rumors spread quickly. People whispered about heroes risking everything to protect the galaxy. Emily wrote about it, capturing the bravery and tragedy of the operation. Her article struck a chord with readers, reminding them of the human cost of war. As the days passed, the stolen blueprints revealed crucial information about the Zetherian superweapon. The Terran Empire now had a fighting chance to stop it before it was completed. But the fight was far from over. The Zetherians were growing stronger, and their hatred for the Terrans burned brighter than ever. Daniel stared out the window of the Eclipse, watching the stars streak by as the ship traveled to its next destination. He thought about Mark, about the sacrifices already made and those yet to come. War was never easy, and it never should be. But sometimes it was necessary. And if that was the case, Daniel vowed to see it through, to honor those who had given everything and to ensure their deaths weren't in vain. Rachel joined him, standing silently by his side. Neither of them spoke. Words weren't needed. They both understood what lay ahead and what they were willing to do to win. The stolen blueprints revealed a chilling truth. The Zetherians were closer to completing their superweapon than anyone had anticipated. It was a massive device capable of destroying entire fleets or even planets with a single blast. If it became operational, the Terran Empire would be powerless to stop it. Fleet Command wasted no time. Plans were drawn up for a massive assault on the heart of the Zetherian forces, a central command hub hidden deep within an asteroid belt. This was the nerve center of their operations, the place where orders were issued and resources coordinated. Taking it out would cripple the Zetherians' ability to fight. Commander Daniel Carter stood in the war room aboard the Eclipse, staring at the holographic map of the asteroid belt. The area was a chaotic jumble of rocks and debris, swirling around a gas giant like a cosmic storm. Navigating through it would be dangerous, but it was the only way to reach the command hub undetected. He turned to his team, who were gathered around the table. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe was reviewing the intel they had gathered, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sergeant Alex Rivera leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression grim. Ensign Lavra Kim sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air. "This is going to be the biggest battle we've faced yet," Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "If we succeed, we might just end this war. But if we fail—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what failure meant. Rachel looked up from the documents. "We'll make it work," she said firmly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "We have to," Daniel nodded. There was no room for hesitation now. Orders were given, strategies reviewed, and preparations made. The fleet mobilized, ships gathering in formation as they prepared to enter the asteroid belt. For the first time in weeks, hope began to stir among the crew. This wasn't just another mission, it was their chance to turn the tide. The journey into the asteroid belt was treacherous. Massive rocks floated lazily through space, colliding with each other and creating unpredictable hazards. Smaller fragments zipped past like bullets, forcing pilots to navigate with precision. Daniel led his squadron through the chaos, his ship weaving gracefully between the obstacles. Behind him, the rest of the fleet followed, their engines glowing faintly in the darkness as they approached the command hub. The Zetherians spotted them. Alarms blared, and enemy ships surged forward to meet the invaders. The battle erupted. Instantly, a cacophony of explosions and laser fire filling the void of space. Ships on both sides clashed violently, their hulls glowing red-hot from the impacts. Daniel's fighter darted through the fray, taking down enemy vessels with surgical precision. His hands gripped the controls tightly, every movement deliberate. And calculated. Rachel stayed aboard the Eclipse, coordinating the attack from the command center. Her voice rang out over the comms, calm and clear despite the chaos unfolding around her. She directed ships to strategic positions, called out enemy movements, and kept the fleet organized. Her focus was absolute, her mind working faster than ever before. Every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of soldiers on the ground. Sergeant Alex Rivera led a team of Marines onto the command hub itself. They had boarded the station during the initial assault, fighting their way through waves of Cytherian defenders. The corridors were narrow and cramped, making it difficult to maneuver. Blaster fire echoed off the walls as Alex and his team pushed forward, room by room. Each step brought them closer to the control center, but also deeper into enemy territory. Lavra stayed close to Alex, her weapon raised and ready. She had never been in combat like this before, and her hands trembled slightly as she fired at approaching enemies. Still, she refused to fall behind. She reminded herself why she was here to protect her home and everyone she cared about. That thought gave her strength, pushing her to keep moving even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. Inside the control center, the Zetherian commander barked orders to his subordinates, trying desperately to regain control of the situation. Monitors displayed the chaos outside, showing Terran ships closing in and ground troops breaching the station's defenses. He knew they were running out of time. With a growl of frustration, he ordered all available forces to converge on the control center. If they could hold it, they might still turn the tide of the battle. Back aboard the Eclipse, Rachel monitored the progress of the ground team. She listened intently to their updates, her heart racing as she heard the sounds of gunfire and shouted commands. Finally, Alex's voice came through the comms. "We're inside the control center," he reported, "but we're surrounded. We need backup now." Rachel relayed the message to Daniel, who immediately redirected a squadron of fighters to provide cover. The ships swooped in, strafing the area around the command hub and drawing fire away from the Marines. It was enough to give Alex and his team a fighting chance. Inside the control center, the fighting was brutal. Alex and his team fought hand-to-hand with the Zetherians, their movements fast and desperate. Lavra ducked behind a console as blaster. Bolts flew overhead, her breath coming in short gasps. She peeked out long enough to take aim at an enemy soldier, her shot hitting its mark. The soldier fell, and Lavra forced herself to move forward, joining the others in the final push. Finally, they reached the main terminal. It was heavily guarded, but Alex didn't hesitate. He charged forward, firing his weapon and shouting for his team to follow. One by one, the guards fell until only the Zetherian commander remained. He stood defiantly, his weapon aimed at Alex. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. "Surrender?" Alex said, his voice low and firm. "It's over," the commander sneered but lowered his weapon. There was no point in resisting anymore. The Terrans had one dot with the commander subdued. Lavra rushed to the terminal and began disabling the station's systems. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, entering commands and overriding protocols. The lights flickered and alarms sounded as the station's defenses shut down. Outside, the remaining Zetherian ships scattered, their coordination destroyed. Daniel watched from his fighter as the enemy fleet retreated. The battle was over. They had done it. They had taken down the command hub. Exhaustion washed over him, but so did relief. The cost had been high, but the victory was worth it. Back aboard the Eclipse, Rachel exhaled deeply, her body sagging with fatigue. She glanced at the monitors, watching as the surviving ships regrouped. The damage was severe, but the fleet had held together. They had succeeded where so many others might have failed. On Earth, journalist Emily Dawson received word of the victory. She wrote her article quickly, capturing the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers who had fought so hard. Her words resonated with readers, reminding them of the courage it took to face such overwhelming odds. People celebrated the win, but they also mourned the losses. War was never easy, and this one was far from over. As the Eclipse limped back toward friendly territory, Daniel stood on the bridge, gazing out at the stars. The scars of battle were visible everywhere: burned hulls, damaged engines, and broken spirits. But there was also a sense of pride. They had struck a blow that would change the course of the war. Now it was up to the Terran Empire to press their advantage and bring the conflict to an end. Rachel joined him, standing silently by his side. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They both understood what lay ahead and what they were willing to do to see it through. The destruction of the Zetherian command hub was a turning point in the war. For the first time, the Terran Empire had struck a blow so severe that it left the enemy reeling. The Zetherians' ability to coordinate their forces had been shattered, and their morale plummeted. But despite the victory, the cost had been immense. Ships were lost, soldiers were dead or wounded, and the fleet was stretched thin. The Terrans knew they couldn't afford to rest. If they did, the Zetherians would regroup and strike back harder than ever. Commander Daniel Carter stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, staring at the holographic map of the contested sector. The galaxy looked smaller now, its vastness overshadowed by the weight of what they had endured. The battle scars on his ship were a constant reminder of how close they had come to failure. He turned to Lieutenant Rachel Monroe, who was seated at her station, reviewing reports from the surviving ships. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but she didn't complain. None of them did. They all carried the burden of war silently, knowing there was no other choice. "We need to keep pushing," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but firm. "If we give them time to recover, we'll lose everything we've gained." Rachel nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "We're running low on resources," she pointed out. "Fuel, ammunition, even medical supplies. We can't keep fighting like this forever." Daniel clenched his jaw. She was right. Of course, the fleet was battered and the supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. But surrendering wasn't an option. "Not after everything they had sacrificed. Then we find a way to make it work," he replied. "We always do." Word of the victory spread quickly across the Terran Empire. Back on Earth, journalist Emily Dawson covered the story with a mix of pride and sorrow. She interviewed families of soldiers who had died in the battle, capturing their grief and gratitude. People lit candles in memory of the fallen, while others cheered the bravery of those who had fought. It was a strange time, a moment of triumph tinged with loss. Emily wrote about it all, trying to convey the complexity of emotions that came with war. Her articles resonated deeply, reminding readers of the human stories behind the headlines. Meanwhile, Fleet Command devised a new strategy. With the Zetherians weakened, the Terrans decided to launch a series of targeted strikes against key installations. The goal was simple: dismantle the enemy's infrastructure piece by piece until they had no choice but to surrender. It was a risky plan, but it was also their best chance to end the war before it dragged on any longer. Daniel laid one of the first missions, targeting a weapons factory located on a remote planet. The facility was heavily guarded, but intelligence suggested it was producing the components for another superweapon. If the Terrans could destroy it, they might prevent the Zetherians from rebuilding their arsenal. The mission began under the cover of darkness, or rather, the endless night of space. A small team, including Daniel, Rachel, and Sergeant Alex Rivera, boarded a transport ship and headed toward the planet's surface. As they descended, the terrain below came into view: jagged mountains, barren plains, and the faint glow of the factory in the distance. The sight filled Daniel with unease. Something about it felt wrong. Though he couldn't put his finger on why, they landed several kilometers away from the factory and approached on foot, moving cautiously through the rocky landscape. The air was cold and thin, forcing them to rely on oxygen tanks. Every step was deliberate, every sound muffled by the stillness of the alien world. Rachel scanned the area with a handheld device, searching for signs of enemy activity. So far the coast seemed clear. When they reached the perimeter of the factory, they found it surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire. Guards patrolled the grounds, their movements methodical and precise. Daniel signaled for the team to take cover behind a cluster of boulders. He pulled out a small drone and sent it into the air, programming it to scout ahead. The drone buzzed quietly, its cameras feeding live footage back to Rachel's tablet. "This place is a fortress," Alex muttered, watching the screen over Rachel's shoulder. "Getting inside won't be easy." "No kidding," Rachel replied, her fingers flying over the tablet as she analyzed the layout. "But I think I see a weak spot." She pointed to a section of the wall where patrols were less frequent. "If we can disable the security system here, we might be able to slip through." Daniel nodded. "Let's move." The team crept closer to the wall, staying low and avoiding detection. When they reached the designated spot, Rachel set to work hacking into the security system. Her hands trembled slightly as she entered commands, but her focus never wavered. After a tense few minutes, the lock clicked open, and the team slipped inside. The interior of the factory was a maze of machinery and conveyor belts, all humming with activity. Workers moved about, oblivious to the intruders in their midst. Daniel motioned for the team to split up, each member tasked with planting explosives at critical points throughout the facility. They moved quickly and quietly, careful not to draw attention to themselves. As Rachel worked on setting charges near a massive reactor, she heard footsteps approaching. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Two Zetherian workers rounded the corner, deep in conversation. Rachel ducked behind a stack of crates, holding her breath. The workers passed by without noticing her, but the encounter left her shaken. "Are you okay?" Daniel whispered over the comms. "I'm fine," Rachel replied, though her voice betrayed her nerves. "Just hurry up." One by one, the team reported back, confirming that the charges were in place. Daniel gave the order to retreat, and they began making their way back toward the exit. But just as they reached the outer wall, alarms blared throughout the facility. Lights flashed red, and shouts echoed through the corridors. "They know we're here," Alex shouted, raising his weapon. "Run!" Daniel ordered. The team sprinted toward the exit, dodging blasts from pursuing guards. Explosions erupted behind them as the charges detonated, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see. Daniel led the way, his instincts guiding him through the chaos. Finally, they burst out into the open, gasping for breath as they ran toward the transport ship. Enemy fighters appeared on the horizon, closing in fast. Daniel cursed under his breath, knowing they wouldn't reach the ship in time. Just as despair began to creep in, reinforcements arrived. A squadron of Terran fighters swooped in, engaging the enemy and giving the team a chance to escape. As the transport ship lifted off, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had done it. They had destroyed the factory. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high, and the war was far from over. Back aboard the Eclipse, the crew celebrated the win, but the mood remained somber. Too many lives had been lost, and the strain of constant fighting was beginning to show. Rachel sat alone in her quarters, staring at the wall. She thought about the workers she had seen in the factory, going about their lives unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Were they innocent? Or were they complicit in the Zetherians' aggression? She didn't have answers, only questions that weighed heavily on her mind. On Earth, Emily Dawson wrote about the mission, highlighting both the bravery of the soldiers and the ethical dilemmas they faced. Her article sparked debate among readers, some praising the Terrans' efforts, while others questioned the morality of targeting civilian infrastructure. War was messy, and there were no easy answers. As the days passed, The Terrans continued their campaign, striking at Zetherian strongholds one by one. Each victory brought them closer to ending the war, but also deeper into morally gray territory. Daniel wrestled with doubts, wondering if they were becoming too much like the enemy they were fighting. Rachel shared his concerns, though neither of them voiced them aloud. There was no time for second-guessing, not when so much was at stake. Finally, the Zetherians issued a message of surrender. Their forces were broken, their resources depleted. They agreed to meet with the Terran Empire to negotiate peace. The news spread quickly, bringing a mix of relief and disbelief. After months of bloodshed, it was hard to imagine the war was finally coming to an end. Daniel stood on the bridge of the eclipse, gazing out at the stars. He thought about all they had endured, the battles, the losses, the sacrifices. It hadn't been easy, but they had held on. Now they had a chance to rebuild, to heal, to create a future where war wasn't inevitable. Rachel joined him, standing silently by his side. Neither of them spoke. Words weren't needed. They both understood what lay ahead and what it had taken to get there. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The war was over, or at least that was what everyone hoped. The Zetherians had agreed to surrender, and peace talks were scheduled to take place on a neutral planet far from the contested sectors. It was a fragile truce, held together by exhaustion and desperation on both sides. For the Terran Empire, it was a chance to step back from the brink of total destruction. For the Zetherians, it was an opportunity to salvage what little they had left. But peace wasn't something that came easily after so much bloodshed. Commander Daniel Carter stood in the briefing room aboard the Eclipse, staring at the holographic map of the neutral planet where the negotiations would occur. The location was chosen carefully, far from any military bases or strategic targets. Both sides wanted to avoid the appearance of hostility, though trust was still in short supply. Daniel's role in the talks would be minimal. He wasn't a diplomat, but he was part of the delegation accompanying Chancellor William Hayes. His presence was meant to symbolize the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers who had fought to bring the war to an end. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe sat across from him, reviewing the details of the mission. Her expression was calm, but her hands betrayed her nerves as they fidgeted with the edge of her tablet. She glanced up at Daniel, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "Do you think this is going to work?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated before answering. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to dash her hopes. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have to try." Rachel nodded, though her unease lingered. She had seen too much death, too much suffering, to believe that peace could come easily. Still, she clung to the possibility, however slim it might be. After everything they had endured, she owed it to herself and to those who hadn't made it to hope for a better future. On Earth, journalist Emily Dawson prepared to cover the peace talks. She had been following the war from its earliest days, documenting every battle, every loss, every moment of courage. Now she was determined to capture the final chapter of the story. Her editor encouraged her to focus on optimism, but Emily knew better than to sugarcoat the truth. Peace wasn't guaranteed, and the scars of war ran deep. She packed her bags and boarded a shuttle bound for the neutral planet, ready to witness history unfold. When the Terran delegation arrived, they were greeted by their Zetherian counterparts. The atmosphere was tense, with both sides exchanging wary glances. Soldiers from each faction stood guard, their weapons holstered but close at hand. Despite the outward show of restraint, the mistrust between them was palpable. Daniel noticed how rigid everyone seemed, their movements stiff and deliberate. It was clear that neither side trusted the other. Not yet. The talks began in a large conference room, the walls adorned with symbols of neutrality. A long table stretched across the center, with representatives from both sides seated opposite one another. Chancellor Hayes took his place at the head of the table, flanked by advisors and military leaders. Across from him sat the Zetherian ambassador, a tall figure with sharp features and an even sharper gaze. Neither man smiled as they exchanged formal greetings. For hours, the two sides debated the terms of the treaty. The Zetherians demanded reparations for the damage inflicted during the war, while the Terrans insisted on strict limitations on their military capabilities. Arguments erupted frequently, voices rising in frustration. At times it seemed like the talks might collapse entirely. But somehow they pushed through, finding compromises where none seemed possible. Daniel observed the proceedings quietly, his presence largely symbolic. He listened intently as each side laid out their grievances, their fears, their hopes for the future. It was strange to hear the Zetherians speak not as enemies but as people trying to rebuild their lives. They weren't so different from the Terrans, he realized. Both sides wanted safety, stability, and a chance to move forward. War had clouded that shared humanity, but perhaps peace could restore it. Rachel accompanied Daniel to informal discussions, held outside the main negotiations. These meetings were less formal, allowing representatives from both sides to interact more freely. Rachel found herself sitting across from a young Zetherian officer named Kale. His uniform was clean but worn, a testament to the hardships he had faced. As they talked, Rachel discovered that they had more in common than she expected. Both had lost friends in the war, both carried guilt for things they couldn't change. Their conversation started cautiously, but gradually walls began to fall. "I didn't want this war," Kale admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of us did, but orders are orders." Rachel nodded, understanding all too well. "Orders don't make it easier," she said. "But maybe we can find a way to make sure it doesn't happen again." Kale looked at her, his expression softening. "I hope so." Back in the conference room, progress continued to inch forward. The treaty slowly took shape, outlining terms for disarmament, trade agreements, and mutual cooperation. It wasn't perfect, no one expected it to be, but it was a start. By the end of the week, both sides agreed to sign the document, marking the official end of the war. As the ceremony concluded, Chancellor Hayes stood and addressed the room. "Today we choose peace," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It won't be easy, and it won't erase the pain of the past. But it gives us a chance to heal, to build something stronger than hatred. Let us honor those who gave their lives by ensuring their sacrifices were not in vain." The Zetherian ambassador nodded, adding his own words. "We have paid a heavy price for our mistakes. Let this moment remind us of the cost of conflict and the value of unity." Applause broke out, tentative at first, but growing louder as the weight of the moment sank in. Tears streamed down faces, relief mingling with grief. The road ahead would be difficult, but for now, there was hope. Emily wrote about the signing ceremony in vivid detail, capturing the emotions of everyone present. Her article struck a chord with readers, reminding them of the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of forgiveness. People shared her words widely, holding on to the belief that peace was worth fighting for. As the delegations departed, Daniel stood outside the conference building, gazing up at the stars. The galaxy felt vast and quiet once again, though the scars of war still lingered. Rachel joined him, standing silently by his side. Neither of them spoke. Words weren't needed. They both understood what lay ahead and what they had sacrificed to get there. "We did it," Rachel said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but filled with determination. "For now," Daniel replied, "but this is just the beginning. We have to keep working, keep hoping. Otherwise, all of this, it means nothing." Rachel nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Then let's make it mean something." Together, they turned away from the stars and walked toward the shuttle that would take them home. The war was over, but the journey to peace had only just begun. And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to believe that it was possible.